Welcome to Info Sounds by InfoDrip, your go-to source for insightful discussions and explorations. Each week, we break down complex ideas into clear, engaging conversations designed to inform and inspire.
All right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating today. We're taking a close look at this report from InfoDrip Limited, Unveiling the Illusion. It's all about the Kenyan shilling, specifically from September 2024 to March 2025. Now, on the surface, the shilling seems pretty stable. It's hanging around 129 KES to the USD after peaking at 130.71 back in February. But is this stability, is it the real deal?
Well, that's where things get interesting. This report, it suggests that this stability, it might be a bit of a facade. Infodrip, they think the Central Bank of Kenya, the CBK, might be actively manipulating the market.
Oh, wow. So the CBK is kind of like pulling
Mhm.
strings behind the curtain.
Yeah.
What makes InfoDrip suspect that?
Well, they point to a few things. The CBK selling off some of its US dollar reserves, that could be artificially boosting the supply, right?
Right.
And then there are these more complex tools they might be using, things like repurchase agreements and term auction deposits. Basically, they're trying to control the money supply, keep the shilling from fluctuating too wildly.
So it's like they're trying to smooth things out, but doesn't that have some downsides? I mean, selling off those dollar reserves, it feels a bit like, I don't know, using your emergency savings to pay for groceries.
Exactly. That's a major concern that the report highlights. These interventions, they could deplete Kenya's foreign exchange reserves. Those reserves are important for a lot of reasons. And plus, it doesn't really fix the problem, does it?
Right. It's just a temporary fix.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. They're not addressing the underlying causes of the shilling's volatility, just creating this illusion of stability. And that could lead to bigger problems later on.
So what you're saying is, like, down the line, this could actually cause a much larger economic correction or something.
It's absolutely. You get this false sense of security, right? So maybe those much-needed reforms get delayed, and then eventually, boom, a bigger problem hits. And on top of that, investors, they see these actions, and they might start to worry. It could make them think twice about investing in Kenya.
So it's a bit of a gamble then.
It is. And that brings us to another interesting point that the report makes. A strong shilling, it might not be as great as it sounds. They dig into the difference between the nominal exchange rate, the NER, what you see quoted every day,
Right.
and the real exchange rate, RER, which takes inflation into account. And RER, well, it paints a truer picture of how competitive the shilling really is.
So, like, even if the shilling looks strong, just based on that everyday exchange rate, its actual purchasing power could be weaker.
Exactly. And that's where some real negative consequences can come into play.
Yeah.
If the shilling is overvalued in terms of that RER, it makes stuff from Kenya more expensive for other countries to buy.
I see. So it hurts their exports.
Exactly. Think about things like tea, coffee, horticulture. Those are huge industries for Kenya. They need to be competitive in the global market.
Right. So even though a strong shilling might sound good on the surface, it could make it harder for Kenya to sell its products, which could end up hurting the economy.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue. A strong shilling can lead to declining export revenues, and that has a domino effect. It impacts economic growth, jobs, you name it.
Now, there's another point I found really interesting in the report. They talk about Kenya's foreign exchange reserves. On the surface, it seems like a good thing, right, having large reserves. But the report seems to suggest that it's not always so straightforward.
It's a bit of a double-edged sword. Those reserves, they act as a safety net during those economic shocks we talked about. They help manage external debt, provide liquidity, all that good stuff. You can think of them like a national emergency fund.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But the report seems to advise against, like, relying too heavily on those reserves. Why is that?
Well, for one thing, if you keep dipping into them to prop up the shilling, you risk depleting them.
Right.
And then you're in trouble when a real crisis hits. And there's also the opportunity cost. That money sitting in reserves, it could be invested elsewhere, maybe in infrastructure or education, things that can benefit the economy in the long run.
So it's a trade-off. Like,
Yeah.
having a big safety net feels good, but it might come at the expense of, like, future growth and development.
Exactly. And constantly using reserves to manipulate the shilling, it can send a bad signal to investors.
Yeah.
They might see it as a sign of weakness, not strength.
So it can backfire.
It can, and it raises a really important question. What actually drives the Kenyan shilling's value?
Mm.
Is it a simple equation, or Or is there more to it? It's definitely not simple. It's this complex web of global and domestic factors all pushing and pulling on the shilling. It's almost like a dance.
A dance. Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah, and maybe we can start by looking at the global side of things, the international forces that impact the shilling.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. How do these global forces affect the Kenyan shilling?
Well, one of the biggest is the movement of other currencies, especially the US dollar. It's kind of the king in international trade.
Right.
So when the dollar's value fluctuates, it has this ripple effect. It can impact the shilling, even if nothing's really changing within Kenya itself.
Oh, interesting. So even if Kenya's economy is doing great, a weakening U.S. dollar could still make the shilling look weaker by comparison.
You got it. It's all relative. And then you have global commodity prices. That's a big deal for a country like Kenya that depends so much on exports. Things like tea, coffee, horticulture.
So if, say, the global price of coffee drops, even if Kenya is still producing the same amount, the shilling could take a hit.
Exactly. And we can't forget about foreign investors. They're always watching Kenya, checking its economic performance, its stability. Their perceptions, well, they directly impact the shilling.
Oh, I see. Because if they lose confidence, they pull their money out, and that weakens the shilling.
Right. And sometimes just a single negative news report can spook them, even if it's exaggerated or not entirely accurate.
It's like perception is everything.
It plays a huge role. But of course, it's not just about what's happening outside Kenya. The domestic situation matters too.
All right, so let's shift our focus inward. What are some of those key internal factors that influence the shilling's value?
Well, inflation is a big one. When prices go up within Kenya, the shilling's purchasing power goes down, right? And that can lead to depreciation. People need more shillings to buy the same things.
So if a loaf of bread suddenly costs twice as much, the shilling is effectively worth less.
Precisely. And the central bank, they're always walking this tightrope. They have to manage inflation without stifling economic growth. It's not easy.
Wow, I'm starting to see how complex this all is. It's like a constant tug of war between all these different forces.
It really is. We've got internal factors, external factors, short-term pressures, long-term goals. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. I'm already eager to dive deeper into those domestic factors.
We'll definitely do that in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive on the Kenyan shilling. Before we move on, we were talking about how a strong shilling might not actually be a good thing for Kenya. Can you give us some real-world examples of how that overvaluation actually plays out?
Sure. Imagine you're a Kenyan tea exporter, right? And you're trying to sell your tea to, say, a company in the UK. If the shilling's overvalued, well, that means the price of your tea in British pounds, it's going to be higher.
So it becomes less competitive.
Exactly. Compared to tea from other countries, Kenyan tea starts to look expensive. And to stay competitive, that exporter, they might have to lower their prices, which squeezes their profits. In some cases, they might even lose the contract altogether.
Wow. So it's like trying to sell a luxury product when there are similar products out there for a lot less.
Yeah, it's a tough sell, and this doesn't just hurt individual businesses. If Kenyan exports across the board become less competitive because of an overvalued shilling, well, that can have a ripple effect through the entire economy. You could see export revenues decline, and that impacts economic growth, jobs, government revenue. It's a chain reaction.
Right. It all kind of ties together. Now, the report also talks about this concept of real exchange rate misalignment. I got to admit, that sounds a bit technical. Can you break that down for us in simpler terms?
Sure. It basically means that the exchange rate we see every day, the one that's quoted, it doesn't really reflect the actual buying power of the shilling compared to other currencies. It's kind of like a distorted mirror. It's giving this skewed picture of the shilling's true value, like what it can actually buy in the global market.
So even if the shilling looks strong, just based on that everyday exchange rate, its actual purchasing power could be much weaker.
Exactly. And that's what creates this misalignment. And this misalignment, well, it can mess things up in the economy, like we've been talking about. And fixing it, it's not just about manipulating the exchange rate, it's about deeper, more structural changes.
Okay, so then the Central Bank of Kenya, they're in a bit of a tough spot, right?
Mm-hmm.
They want to stabilize the shilling, but they also want to avoid making this misalignment worse.
Okay.
What are some of the challenges they face?
Well, they have to balance a lot of different things. Controlling inflation, ensuring the financial system is stable, managing the country's foreign exchange needs. But sometimes the actions they take, they can have these unintended consequences. If they step in too aggressively to prop up the shilling, that could actually make the misalignment worse. and hurt the economy's competitiveness in the long run.
So it's like those short-term fixes could actually cause bigger problems down the road.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. The report really emphasizes the need for sustainable solutions, focusing on the long term.
Okay, so what are some of those long-term solutions? What can actually address these underlying issues?
Well, one really important aspect is making Kenya's economy more competitive overall. That means things like improving the ease of doing business, investing in infrastructure and education to boost productivity, creating an environment where businesses can really thrive and innovate.
So it's about building a stronger foundation for the economy, making it more adaptable and resilient.
Right. And a more diversified economy, it's less vulnerable to shocks. We were talking about diversification earlier.
Right, not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And that diversification, it shouldn't just be about the types of products Kenya produces. It should also be about expanding into new export markets, not relying so much on just a few trading partners.
So spreading the risk, building those connections with more countries around the world.
Right. That makes the economy more resilient to those global shocks. And then, of course, you can't forget about the role of sound fiscal policies.
When you say fiscal policies, what do you mean exactly?
I'm talking about responsible government spending, keeping debt levels in check, creating a stable and predictable tax environment. Those things are crucial for attracting investment and supporting a stable shilling.
So a government's financial decisions can have a real impact on the value of its currency.
Absolutely. Imagine if Kenya's public debt starts increasing rapidly. That could really worry investors, make them pull their money out, and that weakens the shilling. Or if the government suddenly makes huge changes to its tax laws, that creates uncertainty, makes businesses hesitant to invest.
So consistency and transparency are really important.
Absolutely. And all of this, it ties back into the need for those structural reforms we were talking about. Things like streamlining the tax collection process, making it easier to do business, reducing bureaucracy. All those things can make the economy more efficient, more attractive to investors, and ultimately contribute to a stronger, more stable shilling.
It's a holistic approach then.
It is. It's about creating a system that works, a system where sound fiscal policies support a strong economy, and a strong economy allows for more investment and growth. It's a virtuous cycle.
Now, thinking back to what we discussed earlier about the central bank's interventions, it seems like they're walking a very fine line. How can they manage the shilling effectively without, messing things up and creating those distortions in the real exchange rate?
It's all about finding the right balance. They have these different tools at their disposal, and some interventions, like selling dollar reserves, they can provide short-term stability. But they have to be used carefully, strategically. If they overdo it, it can actually backfire and make the misalignment worse.
So it's about being cautious and thinking long term.
Exactly. The focus should be on using monetary policy tools to manage things like inflation and interest rates effectively. For example, they can adjust interest rates to influence borrowing costs and investment, and that can impact the shilling without resorting to these big, heavy-handed interventions.
So it's like using a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer.
I like that analogy. It's about precision, about fine-tuning the economy instead of trying to force it in a particular direction. The central bank's job is to guide the economy towards stability and growth, not to control the shilling's value artificially.
It's about understanding that the exchange rate, it's not just a number. It reflects this whole complex web of economic forces.
Right. A stable and competitive shilling, it's not a goal in itself. It's a reflection of a healthy and resilient economy.
And building that kind of economy, it requires a much deeper approach than just focusing on the exchange rate.
Absolutely. It's about addressing those underlying structural issues, creating an environment where businesses can thrive, and making sure that the benefits of economic growth are shared widely.
Well, this has been really insightful. It's definitely given me a much clearer picture of the challenges and opportunities facing the Kenyan economy. I'm really looking forward to wrapping up our deep dive in the final part.
Me too. We'll dig into some of the key takeaways and explore what this all means for the future.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into the Kenyan shilling. We talked about the illusion of stability, the impact of a strong shilling, and all these complex global and domestic factors that influence its value. And, running through all this has been this idea of resilience. It seems like that's a key concept here.
It really is. When we talk about economic stability, resilience is crucial. It's not just about maintaining a certain exchange rate. It's about building an economy that can adapt, withstand shocks, and ultimately thrive, even when things get tough.
Yeah, it's about being able to bend without breaking. And the report, it seems to argue that real economic stability, it requires a much deeper approach than just trying to control the currency's value.
Hmm.
So what are like the fundamental building blocks of this resilience? What does it actually look like?
Well, diversification is a big one. If Kenya's economy is too reliant on just a few key exports like tea, coffee, tourism, it becomes really vulnerable. If global demand for those products drops or there's some disruption to those sectors, the whole economy takes a hit. A more diversified economy, it can weather those storms better.
Right, it's like having a more balanced portfolio. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And for Kenya, that means supporting the growth of a wider range of industries. Maybe looking beyond the traditional reliance on agriculture and tourism, investing in things like manufacturing, technology, renewable energy. It also means finding new export markets, not being so dependent on just a few trading partners.
So it's about spreading the risk, building those connections with more countries around the world.
Right. It creates a safety net. But diversification alone isn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
We also need to talk about those structural reforms.
When we talk about structural reforms in Kenya, what does that actually mean? Like what specific areas need to be addressed?
Well, it's about fixing those underlying issues that are holding the economy back. Things like improving infrastructure, making it easier to do business, reducing bureaucracy, improving access to finance for small businesses, investing in education and skills development. It's about creating an environment where businesses can not only survive, but really thrive.
So it's about creating a more fertile ground for businesses to grow, which then leads to more sustainable, diversified economic growth.
Exactly. It's about creating a system where businesses can compete on a global level, a system that attracts investment and creates jobs. And it's about making sure that the workforce has the skills to adapt and thrive in a changing global economy.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the government's role in all of this.
Yeah.
What can policymakers do to actually promote this kind of resilience we're talking about?
One of the most important things is maintaining fiscal responsibility. That means keeping government debt under control, avoiding those unsustainable budget deficits. That builds confidence, encourages investment, and ultimately helps stabilize the shilling.
It's like making sure the government's own finances are in order, so they don't become a source of instability.
Right. And it's also about good governance, transparency, creating a predictable policy environment. If businesses know what to expect, they're more likely to invest. For example, if tax policies are clear and consistent, that encourages long-term planning. But if they're constantly changing, it creates uncertainty and discourages investment.
So predictability and stability are key.
Absolutely. And this stability allows for better long-term planning, which is crucial for building resilience. And we can't forget that a resilient economy is ultimately about resilient people. Investing in education, healthcare, social safety nets, those things are essential. They create a workforce that's adaptable, better able to cope with economic shifts.
So it's about creating a system that works for everyone, not just focusing on financial indicators, but also on the well-being of the people.
Exactly. It's about making sure that economic growth translates into real improvements in people's lives. It's about building a society that can not only withstand challenges, but emerge from them stronger.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. We started by asking whether the Kenyan shilling is stable, and we've ended up exploring all these different facets of the economy.
It's amazing how interconnected everything is, isn't it? We've talked about the dangers of trying to control the currency artificially, and we've seen how important those long-term solutions are, those structural reforms, the diversification, the sound fiscal policies.
And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that real economic stability. It's not just about numbers. It's about creating a system that supports businesses, empowers individuals, and creates opportunities for everyone.
It's about building a system that's designed to last, a system that can adapt and thrive, even in the face of global uncertainty.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I hope it's given our listeners a lot to think about.
Me too. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And to our listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. We'll see you next time.